Hello and welcome to week 11 for plant biology. This week's readings are from Concepts of Biology texts, chapters 12 and 13. We're talking about systematics and the basics of systematics, starting with prokaryotes, moving into eukaryotes. So we're really looking at everything from single-cell bacteria to protists to fungi. A lot of these things might seem like they might not necessarily be 100% relevant for a plant biology class, but the reality is there's a lot of photosynthetic organisms out there that are not strictly plants. So it's worth knowing about these things, and many of these organisms also have intimate relationships with plants. And so understanding how scientists structure our knowledge about how things are related, and then having some basic understanding about these other organisms within which plants interact is important. So starting out with chapter 12.1 in Concepts of Biology, we're really looking at how life on Earth is organized. And of course, these are human systems working on developing our understanding of how these organizations are put together. And so to do that, humans have developed a number of tools to do that. And we use taxonomy, which is the science of naming and grouping organisms. We have phylogeny, which is understanding evolutionary histories and relationships between organisms, and systematics, which is the study of organisms to determine those relationships. And so we have some closely related terms that you're going to see in the chapter that are going to come up, and understand that this focus of the scientific endeavor really is interested in finding out where different organisms fit into the broader questions of how all life is related to one another on this planet. We talk about in this hierarchy of understanding how relationships are built. At this highest level, we talk about different domains that organisms are in, and the next biggest group would be kingdoms, and then phylums, and then classes, orders, families, the genus that a species in, and then specifically which species within that genus we're talking about. And there's a number of naming criteria and things like that with binomial naming that you'll read about in the chapter. But that's pretty straightforward, and it's just to give you guys a base understanding of how plant systematics works and why it's important. Because sometimes it feels like you're just pigeonholing, species X, Y, and Z into these slots, and that's all it is. But it's really about understanding those relationships and how those relationships can lead to better understanding of other scientific questions that you might want to ask. When we're determining evolutionary relationships between organisms, a lot of times you'll see words like analogous structures or homologous structures thrown around. Now, the book generally tends to use the forelimbs of animals as examples, because they're something, again, that people are really familiar with. Like if we look at our own hand, we can see, if we know the bone anatomy of our hand, we can understand how that relates to the bony anatomy of a horse or a bat or a bird. We can understand that pretty intuitively, but it's also important to understand that plants also have these homologous and analogous structures. Examples of that would be for an analogous structure, we could look at potatoes, which are this starchy underground stem structure, and we can have a sweet potato, which is an underground root structure, but they are analogous in that they are both involved with the storage of carbohydrates for that plant, but they come from a different evolutionary and different structural sort of pathway. So they are analogous. If you want to talk about homologous structures with plants, then you can look at something like different leaf structures. So I'm going to pull up my trusty office cactus and say, remember that these spines are leaves. So these are homologous structures with the leaves that are, well, now and I will fallen off the trees, but these are homologous structures. So they come from a similar sort of evolutionary or structural root, but they may have changed over time due to evolutionary pressures. And then cladistics is really the method for building these phylogenetic trees so that we can map out the relationships between these organisms. And that really covers what I want you guys to know from Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is it is an important chapter, but sometimes I think don't get lost so much in the lingo, but understand how relationships between organisms are structured, and understand how people use those relationships to better understand the world in which we live. Chapter 12 leads, not surprisingly, into Chapter 13, and Chapter 13 we're really starting to talk about the systematics, or the relationships, the family trees of these organisms, and it makes a lot of sense to start with the most primitive of these organisms, and Chapter 13 starts with just that. It starts out with the prokaryotes, so these are things like the bacteria and the archaea. Again, you may say, why are we learning about bacteria in a plant biology class? Well, the cyanobacteria were the original photosynthetic organisms on this planet, so it's important to understand these evolutionary roots when we're talking about higher plants, and understand that these things all are related back through evolutionary history as photosynthetic organisms. The cyanobacteria gave rise to the chloroplasts inside leaves. If we're going to look at the endosymbiotic theory and understand how photosynthesis moved from single cell bacteria into higher plants. So understanding these relationships is important. Chapter 13 goes on to talk a little bit more about prokaryotic cell characteristics and reproduction. Again, it's important to understand how these organisms develop, and so that we can see the relationships that they share with higher plants. After talking about the prokaryotic cells, Chapter 13 rolls into a group called the protists. Protists are a strange group of organisms. They are not clearly plants, they are not clearly animals, they are not clearly fungi. It's almost like sort of a garbage bin pile where we stick all these creatures, all these animals, or they're not animals, they're all these organisms that don't clearly fit into plants or fungi or animals. And so there's a lot of diversity in the protists. Most of them are single-celled. Some of them are photosynthetic. Again, these are characteristics that are promoted on through evolutionary histories because they're successful. It's also important to know about protists because oftentimes some of the major plant diseases out there are protist-based. If you think about the Irish potato famine that caused a huge amount of loss of life and poverty in Ireland, that really pushed the Great Irish Migration into the United States, that was caused by a protist, and that protist was killing off the potato plants. So understanding more than simply the plant aspect is important, because these things are interrelated. Plants don't live in the world only with plants. They excuse me, they interact with animals and other microorganisms and things like that. So protists are definitely worthwhile looking at and understanding. After the protists, Chapter 13 finishes up with fungi. Again, fungi are not plants. They are not photosynthetic organisms. They are not in the plant group, although they do actually share some characteristics, at least superficially, with plants. They send out their parts of their anatomy out into the soil, very much like plant roots. They're called hyphae in fungi, and they set up fruiting bodies that we'd see as mushrooms or other sorts of structures like that. But fungi are not plants. They do not fit in that same group at all. And there's not a lot of similarity there. Fungi are actually closer related to animals than they are to plants. But as with the disease-causing protists, fungi are really important to understand because fungus definitely influences plant growth, plant success. if you coming from a farming background, you are very well aware that excessive fungal growth on your crop can cause failure of those crops. Another beneficial side to fungi is that oftentimes plants and fungi form what are called mycorrhizal associations, where the fungus grows intimately close to the root system of plants and makes nutrient availability more available for the plant, and the plant then provides some nutrition to the fungus. So these relationships are often very closely tied to the success of the plant and the fungus. Those would be symbiotic relationships. And so again, it's important to understand how these relationships fit together to better understand the world in which we live. So that should finish up your reading for this week. This is week 11 again, and these are chapters 12 and 13 in Concepts of Biology, looking at systematics and the sort of the organizational structure for how we sort of organize our understanding of life, and then talking about some of the characteristics in chapter 13 of these early sorts of forms of life. And as we start moving through the next couple of chapters, we're going to see these different forms of life more clearly defined. So that should keep you guys busy for reading for this week. Have a great weekend.